Welcome to Rocking Our Prize. Today I'm joined by my great friend and collaborator, John Burn-Murdoch. You all know him as the superstar data analysis, quick to spot and identify and visualize cross-national trends on the biggest questions. So for over a year, John and I have been chatting, probably like every week, sharing insights from our combined qualitative and quantitative work. So it is my great pleasure to welcome him. John.
Hello. Great to be here, finally.
Okay, groovy. John, tell me, over a year ago, you and I simultaneously published these two pieces on gendered ideological polarisation. Now I would like you to tell everyone what is the latest data, what's going on.
I think the thing that's clear is that ever since I did that first piece, more and more countries have joined the ranks, as it were. So the thing I'm always wary of in my data columnist sort of role is you write something which is quite sweeping and seems to be true, but then other people look at other data and it doesn't replicate elsewhere. And the reassuring thing for me with this one is that it keeps replicating. And there was a lot of discussion at the time about how true this was in the US. It depended on which survey you looked at. But now we've got the absolute gold standard stuff from places like Pew Research, finding exactly the same thing. So yeah, this divide with young men shifting to the right to some degree, young women shifting to the left to some degree. Originally it was US, Korea, UK, Germany. It's now showing up in Spain. It's showing up in Finland, Poland, all sorts of places. Widest gap is among the youngest, and we see this pretty much everywhere.
Does it vary according to the type of questions you ask? So some people, for example, might look at some things on the economy, you don't see it. What kind of questions does it hold for? Or some, for example, it might be that men support gender equality in many ways, but then say, I think feminism has gone too far. So there is some sort of nuance there.
100%, loads of nuance. And that's what makes this a tricky one, because you can look at one bit of this data, concoct an entire narrative around it, which fits that data. But then if you look at it in a different way, it's totally different. The most striking example of this is, if you look at Korea, the biggest political shift there is young men shifting rapidly to the right. But if you look at almost any other country, the biggest shift is young women shifting to the left. So that's one thing straight away. If we're looking at this through the political lens, in most countries, the bigger shift is young women moving to the left. Young men are a little bit more conservative than young men 20 years ago, but not massively. But then if you look at things like hostile sexism, the shift is almost all among young men.
Let's clarify that hostile sexism for our listeners.
So these are your classic statements about, do women try to control men? Do women they struggle to laugh at themselves? Do they take everything too seriously? It's these classic sexist trope questions, and this is where we see this really striking thing of men's agreement with those statements has always been higher among the oldest, lower among the youngest. But suddenly we're seeing young men in their late teens and 20s now agreeing with these statements much more than men in their 30s and 40s, even 50s and 60s in some cases. So if we're talking about politics, it seems to be outside of Korea, mainly about young women shifting further to the progressive left. If we're talking about attitudes around gender, it's more young men shifting to the right. And of course, as I say this, caveat with all of this is some young men. Not all men. But yeah, this is a subset, and I'm sure we'll get onto exactly what subset later on.
Oh, actually, no, wait. Firstly, am I right in thinking that France and Italy could be slightly different with not a big gender gap in support for the far right?
Yeah, exactly. So any analysis of political attitudes and voting has to come with the caveat that a lot depends on the political landscape of different countries in terms of both the number of parties. Like there's less scope for vote choice polarization in a country like the US, where you've only got two parties, than there is in countries like the UK and continental Europe, where you tend to have a very progressive left environmentalist party and a radical right party, which are sort of more natural vessels for those votes. Same thing in Korea. On the right. So yeah, this is contingent on sort of party structures. It's also contingent on leaders. So Italy and France, of course, you have female leaders on the populist right, which is almost certainly playing a part in this. But also those are both RN in France and the radical right in Italy are very, very, very long established. So history is also playing a role there. All sorts of things going on. It's this tricky thing where when we look at voting patterns, you're measuring people's political leanings, but you're also measuring the capacity for those political leanings to fit into different boxes, which is why the broader attitudinal questions I think can be more interesting. But again, there you're reliant on how many of these questions have been asked consistently over time.
Okay, so that's brilliant. So when we think about politics, we need to think about supply and demand and whether the parties are already preformed and what people's options are. Okay, I'm totally with you. Now, you raise the question of the subset, not all men. Tell me, when you dig into the data, where do you see which kinds of women are veering far left and which kinds of men seem to be gravitating towards more conservative views?
Yeah, so this is interesting because, again, we actually see a much clearer pattern among women. So women without a degree have moved much less than women with a degree. And again, we're mainly talking about young women here because that's where the gap is. So in the Pew Research data in the US, there's been a much bigger shift to the left among college-educated women than among other women, although all have shifted left. And I think that's interesting and we'll come on to this more, but I think it's about this culture of the ascendant. There's this real sense that if young women with a degree are succeeding in ways that previous generations hadn't, which I think means that things that are happening in the world at the moment get framed in a different way for that group. On the other side, we do see a bigger conservative shift among the least educated young men, but it's actually not as wide a gap. And that's partly, again, because I think the shift towards the right has actually been more muted among men than the shift towards the left among women. But also because I think part of what's happening here is that men's sense of going backwards in relative status is something that seems to be on some level experienced by the gender as a whole, by the sex as a whole, rather than by specific subgroups. But again, there are caveats on this. So if we look again at those real hostile sexist views, that does seem to be overwhelmingly a phenomenon among the least well-educated young men. But then the other bit that's interesting here is if we look at this all by age, by far the biggest divergence is among teenagers. And that for me is interesting because if we're going to try to explain this as a response to these big economic shifts, like the declining labour force participation among men over time, women catching up on earnings at young ages, you would expect the biggest gaps to be among people in their, say, 20s and 30s who are living that. The fact that we see the biggest gaps among teens, I think, suggests that either it's less about that material reality and more about some of the other factors I'm sure we'll come on to, or at least that material reality is being refracted through a lens, which means it's particularly sticky for the youngest.
Yeah, brilliant. I totally agree. I mean, there's a brilliant analysis of 160,000 Norwegian high school students aged, these boys aged between 13 and 16. They're probably not so alert to labour market realities, and Norway's doing very well economically.
Exactly.
So that couldn't explain this rise of these men expressing this hostile sexism.
Exactly that. And that's similar stuff. So I looked at the European Social Survey, which surveys people down to the age of about 15. And the biggest gender divide on whether people consider themselves left-wing or right-wing is among the 15 and 16-year-olds. That's bigger than it is among 20-year-olds, which is bigger among 30 and so on and so forth. And there's another interesting nuance there that I've not written about before, but I'll give you as an exclusive. Although we have chatted about this on WhatsApp before, which was part of this actually among teenagers, I think, is just that a larger share of teenagers, when asked about politics in the past, used to just say, don't know. And now they'll give an answer left or right. So a lot of the widening of the gap is don't knows bifurcating into left and right.
Oh, how fascinating.
And right, because I think, well, yeah, so I think that speaks to, and again, we'll come on to this in more detail, the role of online stuff here. Because I think what's happening is that if you were 15 or 16, 20 years ago, politics and worldviews and are you trad or are you progressive and that kind of stuff just was not a big part of your life. You were just, in the park with your mates or that kind of thing. But now that people are online, even if they're not seeing stuff that is explicitly political, you're seeing stuff which is nudging you towards taking a position. And so I think, we'll get onto all the online stuff in detail, but I think that the fact that the gap is widest among teenagers and is about the shift from don't know to certainty, I think speaks to that.
I would say that the news has become more entertaining and engaging than ever. So maybe 20 years ago, middle-aged and older people would pick up a copy of the wonderful FT, Guardian, Times, whatever, Telegraph, but a 14-year-old boy may not spend his evenings in bed with the Guardian, right? That may not be the most exciting thing he can do. But now, if it's all on TikTok and people are talking about reform and they're saying, a very simple message that resonates with a young teenage guy, it's much more engaging.
Exactly.
Video, 30-second videos is much more engaging than an FT article.
Yeah,
no
offense. It's true. That's why I do the 30-second videos as well. But no, I mean, just as a very brief tangent on that, I think that's really important. This is all about convenience. There's this sense that I've become a big skeptic of the news avoidance narrative, which is that, people avoid the news because it's negative. That I just don't think that's supported by any evidence. People might think that that's why they're avoiding the news, but social media is more negative. So I think it's just convenience. It's become far more convenient and engaging and entertaining to get news on those platforms. And so even if it is really negative and scaremongering and all that kind of stuff, that's where you end up. So
yes, totally.
Digression over.
So by having, paradoxically, more engaging news, younger political engagement, the outcome might not be what, centrists wished for.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. And obviously there's with the discussion at the moment about lowering the voting age in the UK, it'll be really interesting to see which way that goes. And I think a lot of the people talking about that are, these very highly educated, very politically engaged people who are thinking about how they would have voted age 16. But that is not what is happening with most 16-year-olds. So we shall see.
Absolutely. One more point about subsets. As I recall from the US data on being pro-Democrat, that was especially high among single women.
Yes, exactly. And this is another one where single men and coupled men, there's not a huge difference in left-right views, but single women, coupled women, very, very big difference. And now, again, caveat that it's only the US where I've looked at this in detail. YouGov actually did some custom analysis for me where they broke this out. And what that shows is that a bunch of the divergence between young men and women is a compositional effect of there being now much more single women. So I think it's like a third to a half of young women's leftward shift is a function of increasing singledom among young women, and young women always having been more progressive than those in couples.
I think this is really important, and it's the second half of the social media effect, because the social media effect is not just about ideological persuasion online, but also the fact that if people are spending so much more time online, then they're not necessarily socializing, hanging out, or coupling in person, and they're not developing the empathy and understanding to thinking about different perspectives. And I think that friendship, hanging out, being married, coupling, or whatever kind of relationship you want, is if we really care about someone, we empathize with their perspective, we listen to how their day was, and we hear another side of the story. And so those singles would have always had a much more insular echo chamber, single-minded kind of view. And so if you just increase the proportion of them, we should expect a rise in polarization.
Exactly. And I think it's there's a feedback loop here as well, right? So I'm a big believer in the sort of social media displacement theory that we people focus too much on, like, is social media actively doing stuff, whereas it's more just the absence of interaction, in-person interaction. But I think, the other part of this is that if 15, 16-year-olds have a much better sense of whether they are left or right, where they are in attitudes, that is also that is adding friction to coupling and friendships.
Yes, it's difficult to know to what extent they cause each other. My view is just there's some sort of mutual reinforcement.
Exactly.
But do you have a guess on?
I think displacement is most of this. And if I think about all of this stuff as it's a big funnel, and you end up being like friendships and relationships and stuff are the sort of end of the funnel, where what goes into the funnel is face-to-face interactions. And so if you pour fewer interactions in, you get fewer friendships and relationships out. So I think that is just a much simpler, and that requires fewer heroic assumptions. Whereas the sort of direct radicalization stuff, I would be amazed if it's not happening, but I think it's maybe a smaller part of this. And actually, on that, there's a really interesting thing I'm meaning to write about, but I'll mention on here because I've already seen it, which is we think a lot about this as whether people identify themselves as being more left or right, more progressive, more conservative. But if you even see this if you look at what issues people care about. So all around the world, people run these monthly polls of what are the most important things in the country at the moment. So crime, immigration, whatever. In Ireland, the share of young women who say that the situation in Gaza is one of the top issues at the moment is about 4 times as high as it is among young men.
Wow.
And for young men, the share saying immigration is about 3 or 4 times as high as among young women. And again, that will happen for all sorts of reasons. And there have always been these historical divides. Women are more likely to say they're worried about health and education, men about crime and immigration. But the magnitude of that divide, for me, knowing what the experience of apps like TikTok and Instagram looks like at the moment, I'd be very surprised if there's not at least some self-reinforcing thing going on there, where you go on TikTok, and if you are already, on average, predisposed to care more about or to be more interested in images of what's happening in Gaza, versus on the other side, someone's more predisposed to be worried about immigration, if you're then just fed more and more of that stuff, it's going to give you this sense of certainty that this really is the thing in both directions. So yeah, I think that latter bit, we need more research. It's hard to know how much this is shaping views versus just reflecting and reinforcing them. But the displacement thing, I think, is more solid.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very skeptical to comment or speculate on like biological gender differences because these are so difficult to detach from our socialization. But for whatever reasons, we do see in multiple data sets that women are often sort of more concerned with like equality and suffering and how people are doing all over the world. Like, for example, I lecture on international development. A large fraction of our cohort is female. Like, women seem very concerned about poverty overseas and they want to do good in the world. So there's a really nice economics papers showing that women, even if they're MBA graduates, they typically want to work for a job with purpose, for a company that's doing good in the world. Right? So they'll even take a massive, massive pay cut because they don't want to work for a company that's toxic. They want to work for a company that has good values. So women may prioritize a sense of moral, social purpose over profit. And in a number of other respects, it seems that men are concerned with what they might perceive as threats to the group. So if men see there's a problem as a threat to the group, then they're like, okay, we need to address this, if they perceive that as migration. So I could certainly understand how you might have these, minor gender differences, and then once you're clicking on Instagram or scrolling on Instagram or TikTok, you can feed those preferences. The algorithm is catering to your preferences. You're hearing everyone else within your bubble constantly post on Gaza, and that reaffirms a sense of righteous resistance, similarly for immigration. And then on top of that, I think that, and you've written on this, that social media, or maybe we discussed this before one of your columns, that social media, because we're lowering the boundary, that we're lowering the entry barriers, making it easier for anyone to publish anything, then you get more of an ideological diversity of content for which we can tune into. So you get more anti-establishment critics in every way, both you're catering to our own preferences greater than ever, and also the supply of it is more diverse than ever.
Exactly, yeah. And ever since 2012, 2011-12, and the Arab Spring, it's been completely accepted as fact that social media is naturally anti-establishment. Giving voice to people who didn't previously have one.
Yes.
And there's no question about that. But then we subsequently ask all these questions about, well, how can we be sure about this? How are we sure that it's anti-establishment? Even though we all seem to have agreed that 12, 13 years ago. It's just that now that it's playing out in the rich West, we're suddenly questioning it again. But yeah, I think that's clearly true. Just there is a natural anti-establishment bias on social media, and then on the ideological point, yeah, loads of research by people like Jay Van Bavel, Claire Robertson in the US, who this idea of social media as the funhouse mirror, where extreme voices and opinions get magnified. And again, this isn't even a complicated thing. It's just that if you have normal centrist, or no, centrist means a million things, so let's just say normal moderate views, why would you post them online? Because there's nothing spicy about that. Everyone already agrees it's not exciting to say. Whereas if you have something that's a bit out there, you're like, oh, this will get a reaction. So it's just, again, the incentives built into the system that encourage that. But then just briefly coming back to the point about how the reinforcement of you're on Instagram and it's reinforcing what you maybe were already predisposed towards. Again, I think that just fits really nicely with the decline of don't knows aspect of this. It's not necessarily about people having their views changed, but they're growing in confidence about those views. So people who wouldn't previously have fitted all these views together into a worldview now are.
Okay, I want to go on a historical tangent now, because you said, smartphones are anti-establishment. And I think it's useful to recognize and theorize how many but not all waves of technology have been anti-establishment. So if we go back, 500 years ago, when your and my great-great-grandparents lived in villages, then there was very little technology. Monks were lumbering around with these ginormous manuscripts, and, there was little means of communication between different groups. So we were beholden to our neighborly gossip and stuck in our ways. And then you get printing, this radical form of large-scale communication, and that, for the first time ever, did enable the critics. That empowered people like Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation to say, if you to the Catholic Church, and we don't want to pay all this money to get into heaven. And similarly, you get pamphlets and letters, which, fan flames of yet more dissent for the American and French Revolution. So those waves of technology were also anti-establishment. You get women novelists in the 19th century, right? Jane Austen, that is in a sense anti-establishment, because instead of, presupposing female obedience and women sort of complying with whatever's going on, they're championing, female agency. Reader, I married him, Jane Eyre declares. So then in the 20th century, I think actually you get more pro-establishment technology in the fact that many governments increasingly have state media. And so that enables sort of like nation-building homogenization. So, for example, we have the BBC, and that to some extent is pro-establishment in that everyone tunes into BBC News. Here's a common story. And that, in a way, has many brilliant benefits. It's nation building, it's social cohesion. We're all coming together, listening to the same radio. But then you get incrementally these fault lines. So there's a nice book called precisely that, Fault Lines, about how in America, for example, and you've written on this too, how the US has seen this bifurcation and ideological polarization in news and entertainment moving to the left and the right. And as you have technological advances, lowering the boundaries, the barriers to entry, you get more and more companies cropping up, sharing their ideologies. We saw the rise of talk radio, catering to the right from the 1970s. And I see smartphones as the latest instantiation of a disruptive technology that empowers the anti-establishment critics, because as we discussed over WhatsApp, our WhatsApps are so important. As we discussed over WhatsApp, that and I think as I was saying then, that unlike an institution, a radio host like Joe Rogan, he's not so beholden to institutional rules and checks and balances, and it's just one guy can pretty much say whatever they like and reach a broader audience without all the constraints that would have been imposed by, say, the FT or the CNN or FT. So I think every wave of technology sort of can empower the anti-establishment critics, who can then reach an even bigger, more engaged audience.
Yeah, 100%. I think the only thing I would think about adding there is, and this isn't original. I annoyingly I can't remember who I got this from, but most of this argument is that most of these previous expansions of the media or evolutions of the media, while they did expand the range of people who could publish, they mainly expanded the number of people who could consume. The media's become more and more mass, as it were. But because it was you still required capital and investment, whether you were printing or doing TV, you were still from sort of the upper echelons. Whereas what's happened now is that it's literally everyone in their backyard. And I think that's interesting in the US context, because I think the reason the printing and TV maybe led to more, still led to more anti-establishment polarization stuff in the US than elsewhere, is because the US is that much more religious. So you already had these big disagreements about certain issues in the US among the elite that you didn't necessarily have, or at least not as wide in Europe. Whereas with social media, it's now suddenly everyone, establishment or not, rich or poor. And that's why I think this latest shift over the last decade or so seems to have been more seismic than the ones we had in the past. So the ones we had in the past were like significant shifts, but still kind of shifts within the range of views that wealthy people held, because you needed to be wealthy to do this. Whereas now it's suddenly the whole of society getting their views out.
Totally. I agree. I'm sorry. That's what I meant by lowering the barriers to entry. You don't need any capital. It's one man and a smartphone, or one woman and her Yeti microphone. Or you don't even need the Yeti microphone. That's optional. And I think it's paradoxical, ironic, and a little bit uncomfortable that in many ways technology has been democratized, and yet this has led to us and people have greater freedom than ever. People are free. So many. When I study left-wing social movements in Latin America, they, left-wing academics and anthropologists will say that radio was so great, and community radio, and it gave a voice to the marginalized. And, that's all great and that's all wonderful. Yes, we as democratic liberals want everyone to have a voice. It's the most progressive thing ever for everyone to have a voice. But then paradoxically, when every single person has a voice and can communicate to anyone else, pursuing their own preferences, we actually end up with a society that is more bifurcated, more splintered, and more polarized, and people are not necessarily happy.
Yeah, and again, I think there's just a really simple thing here of, in 2011-12, it was social media is empowering the masses to overturn the conservative establishment. This is great. Now it's social media is empowering the great unwashed to turn against liberalism. This is terrible. But it's the same thing.
Yes, totally. I mean, that's a question that I want to ask you. I don't know if you've looked at it. How has support for liberalism changed? And there, I mean, in the European sense of thinking that anyone should say whatever they like rather than policing other people's thoughts. Do you see that in the data?
Annoyingly, I've not seen that. I'd be very interested in any long run study that tracks that. So I guess when I talk about liberalism here, I'm just using political parties as proxies again. So we've seen this collapse of the moderate centre over the last decade or so, and the rise of particularly the radical right, but also the radical left.
So the reason why I asked that question, Pew, I think 2 weeks ago, came out with a survey on the declining support for democracy across many OECD countries. And one thing could be that, many governments in democratic countries, they could be perceived as failing to deliver, public goods and services, economic growth, housing, etc. But another aspect I think is very related is that if you are immersed in an echo chamber of righteous resistance and you very strongly believe in your views, whatever they are, then you may become less tolerant of the opposition. And there's this wonderful book called Entrenched, out with Yale University Press, and the basic argument is that each political side really wants to entrench their views. So if you think that stopping immigration or supporting Gaza is the most important thing in the world, then you would be willing to support the strong man to manifest that and make sure liberals make sure the other side can't destroy it.
Yeah, totally. I think all the stuff about support for democracy is really interesting. And I think there are two things at the same time. One is we should be wary of just interpreting this as everyone wants autocracy. Because, I think a lot of this is just, I've been living in democracy for 35 years. I still haven't got a house, blah, 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 blah. The system doesn't work. But, there does, because if you ask more nuanced versions of the questions, there is, there's also this perhaps smaller but very real sense of just why are we using this system? I have strong, confident views about what needs to be done. We should get a strong person in. Or even if someone isn't firmly sort of ideological about their views. There can just be a sense of things are going so badly that we need a strong person to rip things up and just try some coherent thing, whatever that thing is. So yeah, I think we should. It's the sort of take things seriously versus literally thing. I think we should take seriously the idea that there is a genuine dissatisfaction with democracy and the rising support for strong leaders, but the exact numbers, if one just takes the number of people saying they're dissatisfied with democracy as appetite for autocracy, then I think that's probably overstating it.
Here's a puzzle. Why do you think, no, so far we've been saying, maybe social media has these polarizing effects, these engaging content, people spending more time alone. Why do you think it might be that so much of the shift in beliefs has been among young women and young men haven't moved as much?
There's a few theories here, right? So one is that young women have always been more mimetic,
right,
more attuned to the idea of like what the cool thing is and what the cool thing isn't. And so and yeah, that's backed up by loads of research over the decades. This isn't just a sort of lazy gender stereotype.
No, I totally buy that. Yeah. And we see that with the women seem to be much more concerned about group inclusion and peer approval, much more sensitive to what their friends are doing. And this may also explain, and we are both big fans of Lucy Fuchs' work on mental health, so that if you become immersed in a sea of mental health issues, that can become more widespread.
Exactly.
100% I'm with you.
Yeah.
So it could be something about women's disposition to pay attention to their friends leads to an escalating
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's almost certainly part of this. Other aspects, I do think this sort of ascendance, this socioeconomic ascendance, could well be part of this. Like there was a really interesting bit of research recently done by a researcher called Katja Smit, and she was trying to look at what is mediating the gender divide. And I think this was in Germany, and she found that there is this growing sense among young men and young women. There's this growing sense among young men and women that society is not being fair to them, but young men and young women interpret that in different ways. So young men, when there's a sense that things are unfair, they look for people or things to blame. Whereas young women, when there's a sense that things are unfair, are looking to help the people who are subject to that unfairness.
Oh, how interesting! A sort of men lash out, and women want to be empathetic and kind and care.
Yeah, again, massively generalizing. But then this did seem to be in the questions that she asked in this survey. What seemed to be happening was a differential response to a sense of unfairness.
But you still see lots of progressive women's groups being, some extremist progressive groups can also be very aggressive, attacking and blaming in their bid to help others.
No, definitely. So as I say, this is a partial and not completely proven out explanation for what's going on. But if you look at we talked earlier about where else does the gender divide show up in attitudes, and immigration being an example. And that is another one where, on average, young men are more likely to view immigration as a threat. Young women are more likely to view, to be worried about immigrants, refugees getting the help they need. So, yeah, I think, again, unclear how big of a factor this is. But that slight predisposition to respond to unfairness in different ways might be part of this.
Let's talk about immigration a little bit more. So I think you've written a piece on this. I mean, I can just say you've written a piece on this and it'll probably be true to any topic. But am I right in recalling that you did once write a piece, or maybe we discussed it. It's difficult to draw the line. I apologize. That whether is it because young men see migration as more of a competition for young men's jobs specifically, or that what's the data that there's more of an economic hit to young men on immigration specifically? Just to tease out those different theories of what's going on.
Yeah, certainly because of the sectors that immigrants have often historically come into, especially low-skilled immigrants, they've often been male-dominated. There is a real material, measurable thing there. Again, it's that question of how much of that is driving this, how much of it is a response to material changes, as we talked about earlier, or how much is it more vibes. And I think
because two things could be true. It could be true that the migrants are more likely to adopt male jobs, but that could be totally separate. That may not be causal.
Right, exactly.
It could just be a coincidence.
Exactly. And I think the point in favor of the coincidence argument, or at least in favor of it not being that simple, is that immigration into the UK recently, huge amounts has been into healthcare, right?
Yes.
Which is female dominated, but that has not been followed by any sort of anti-immigration shift among the women who might otherwise have had those jobs. So I think that would suggest that it's not dismissing material reality, but other things, the way that material reality gets refracted, either through the media or through the way different people think about things differently, I think is a bigger part of it.
For me personally, when I look at people's reactions and engagements with these stories, it's such a vivid and clear example of how our understanding of the world is mediated by the sort of cultural narratives that we buy into. Like the fact that, for example, if we take Britain's recent history of grooming gangs and rape gangs, it is predominantly men who engage with those stories, even though the harm is is to women. So, from a sort of rational perspective, you would have thought women would be more concerned about potential rape, or if they have identity as group, if they're concerned about their gender as a group, if they've got some self-interested concern, you have anticipated the rational response would be for women to be more concerned. But like you say, that's not showing up in the data, and I think that shows you that what you think is a priority or how we respond to things is clearly mediated by the way that we build these narratives to understand the world. It's all mediated through culture. So I like the idea that the rapid shift in women's views might be partly mimetic. What do you think of the idea that there's been a backlash to sustained progressive campaigns cheering and championing women? So, for example, recently I was in southern Sweden and I gave a couple of talks about this gender polarization, and I suggested that if progressives constantly celebrate female empowerment while criticizing some aspects of male behavior while ignoring men as a group, then that might be perceived as a form of exclusionary tribalism, whereby men may not feel wanted, valued, or that they matter, and as a result, they may, shift to groups or charismatic speakers that do make them feel like they matter, because everyone wants to feel that they're important, that they're valued, etc. How much of the shift in sort of men becoming a bit more conservative do you think might be a form of backlash to these progressive campaigns?
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly part of what's happening here. And we do see this in the data. So in the US General Social Survey, if you look at different questions about gender roles and feminism and that kind of thing, some of them show a divergence, some of them don't. So if you ask general questions about whether men and women should be equal, that kind of thing, you still get young men agreeing with these in the same proportions they always have. And the gap between young men and women is either small or non-existent and hasn't shifted. But when you look at more of an affirmative action framing, like should women be given, should special efforts be made to put women into jobs, that's where you see a bit of a divergence. And so again, I think it comes down to this fairness question. And you see similar things if you look at affirmative action for race and ethnicity as well. So it's not necessarily the case that young men are just becoming sort of anti-feminism, anti-young women, anti-gender equality. It's specifically this bristling at the sense that suddenly they are being pushed aside as part of this movement, which I think it's an important nuance, and it's because again it brings it back to fairness, and makes it, I think, much more easy to understand why people who are not sexist, not toxic men, that kind of thing, could rationally respond to some of the shifts over the last 10 years in this way.
100% agree. And I would say two things: that there seems to be a real problem with self-correction. So as you've previously written, to go on a tangent, so the UNFPA constantly publishes these predictions about population, but they seem as an organization, they're struggling to revise their priors to think that actually we're seeing this decline in fertility, this rapid decline. They always say, oh, the line's going to change. And I think that many feminist organizations, well-intentioned, because they're immersed in these echo chambers, they may struggle to think two things. One, oh, actually, women's education is doing super, super well. Graduates seem to have a very similar pay as you've showed. And also fertility is dropping. So maybe the motherhood penalty is going to be much smaller in the future because fewer mothers. And they struggle to, and even in Sweden, we see that the gender pay gap is now very, very low, right? But they're still struggling to look at that data and to pivot and to reflect and think, well, is this a form of exclusionary tribalism? Could this trigger a backlash? Is this necessary? Is this really a strategic way of building broad support for gender equality? And I think that we have tended, as a sort of centrist media commentariat, to cushion and permit many aspects of progressive thought that are not so bound in strategic evidence. And I like to liken this to the example of a surgeon. So when a surgeon is tackling someone with bowel cancer, they don't just blast the body with chemo. They do a very careful surgical operation that's been tested, and then they apply some kind of chemo that's been through lots of RCT. So we're very strategic in how we address the cancer. And likewise, I'd like progressive campaigners to think, right, much more strategically, how do we build an inclusive coalition for gender equality? Does it necessarily advance our well-intended cause to just be blasting, go women, big up the women? Because actually some people could feel alienated and excluded, just as if women would feel alienated and excluded if everything was going to men, or if all the campaigns were sent.
Yeah, completely. And I like the analogy here of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So Obama famously, while being a black person, didn't massively make his campaign about that, right? His economic messaging was very much about lifting up all disadvantaged people.
Yes.
And so whatever your race, you could listen to that and think, yeah, this guy gets it. Whereas Hillary Clinton was just deplorables, and she was just saying aiming for the same goal, but just doing exactly what you're saying, like blasting the cancer, as it were. There wasn't as much nuance, and it was very, very explicit. And of course, there are many, many, many differences between the two candidates. We can't simplify it down to that, but they, of course, had very different political careers. So, yeah, I think there is this sense of, among some progressives, I feel this injustice strongly.
Yes.
And I'm confident in my opposition to this thing, so I'm just going to call it out. And again, there's nothing technically wrong with that. There's nothing even sort of factually wrong with a lot of what is being said. But if you say things in a way that slaps someone in the face, rather than saying things in a way that, voice that same injustice, but in a way that allows that other person to feel like, hell yeah, that is wrong, instead of thinking, you just slapped me in the face. Yeah, you're going to have different outcomes.
Definitely. I think everywhere, wherever there is some sort of aggressive mobilization, that seems to trigger a defensive reaction. And let me share two more examples. So a while back, you had a great piece on how the U.S. the Trump broke the Democrats' thermostat, and you showed that the strong Democrats had moved far, far over from the median voter in terms of affirmative action and support for migration. And I showed that to a very prominent U.S. journalist, and she had no idea. And I just thought this was such a great example of how many people may not realize how out of touch they are. And that, regardless of whether one is right or wrong on the moral veracity and truth of your own opinion, just not realizing that you're out of touch. And then we give another example of being in an echo chamber. So this April, I went to Brazil, and I was staying in the outskirts of Sao Paulo. I went to a school just next to a favela, so in a very poor part of Brazil. And Brazil, like the US, like the UK, has seen this issue of disadvantaged men really struggling in education, right? And so I went to the school, I introduced myself. There was a very kind teacher who took me to the staff room, who introduced me to the other teachers. I said, I'm interested in gender. And immediately one of the two teachers says, yes, we need to talk about trans men. And he was very, very confident that he wanted to talk about trans men. And I said, oh, sorry, to clarify, I was like, I'm more interested in why more disadvantaged men are struggling. and I'm more interested in that larger population group. I've got no judgment about anything. I was just very interested in that larger population group. But it was so interesting in this interaction that one sense of moral righteousness about what should be our priority can just shape how we interpret all the other data. And I think this is why I'm so confident in the media hypothesis, that it's not just about economics, it's not just about houses, it's not just about jobs, but the way we interpret the world is so shaped by our community, our connections, and smartphones are just radically altering that.
Yeah, totally. And the way I've been thinking about it is it's like a supply and demand thing. So I think the material realities create the demand for certain narratives, and then social media supplies that. Like, I think in a world where there were still big gender pay gaps, like men still were more likely to work and earn much more, someone like Andrew Tate would not have the same cut through.
Right.
So I think it's both. Like, the material reality creates there's something there to grab onto. When young men then hear these messages, they think, yeah, that rings true to me when I think about it. So yeah, I think it's both, but the community, the messaging, the environments people exist in, I think are critical.
I'm surprised when you talk about, going back to your earlier point, that there's not so much of a difference between married and single men. And I find this so surprising, because I would have expected single men who feel rebuffed and ghosted by women to be more annoyed, right? So I think we can both agree that, dating apps are really crappy for men, because men have a much higher ratio. So you're being set up to fail, that you're more likely to be ghosted, you're more likely to be ignored, to feel unwanted. And these are all horrible, horrible feelings. And in a way, it's surprising that we don't see a stronger reaction. I mean, maybe it's just that once you get these frustrated, annoyed men, they then circulate those ideas, which, married men or coupled men also accept. But it's surprising we don't see a more visible reaction.
Well, so the caveat there again, that was on left and right rather than on hostile sexism. So the problem with the hostile sexism stuff is the share of young men who agree with these hostile sexist statements is often low enough that doing like subgroup analysis just gets tricky, like samples get very small. So I don't have evidence to say that hostile sexism levels are similar between married and single men. But on the voting for the left and right, or to the extent to which people identify as conservative and liberal, that's where the married and single men look similar.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. Okay, but let's talk about economics more and disadvantaged men. So you've been doing a lot of analysis about men being more likely to be out of education, training, or employment. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so this shows up in most countries. Like, there's been a very long, slow moving trend of male labour force participation dipping, and then when we go down to young ages, you're seeing two things. One is that same trend among young men, decline of historically male-dominated industries, whether that was manufacturing, that sort of thing. This is a very old story that everyone knows. And then on the other side, the rise of female labour force participation. So obviously part of that is just people having no kids or having kids later. So you're more likely to be in work, because of course that has a much bigger impact on women than men. Part of it is young women being more educated. Part of it is just general societal progress and government policies that make it easier for women to work and have families if necessary. So we've basically seen initially a convergence and now a crossover in many countries of the share of young people who are out of work. So that's something, as I say, you see it in the UK, you see it in much of Europe. I think the US isn't quite there yet, and that's mainly because young women in the US are less likely to work in a more religious and conservative society. Which we always forget, the US is actually really quite different to most of the West in terms of religion. But yeah, the direction of travel is very, very clear. And I think both of these things matter, right? The crossover point does matter, but I think the direction of travel is almost equally important, right? Because everyone has a sense on some level a sense of how things are going, and those senses for young men and young women socioeconomically are quite different.
Yes, I would add one more point to your gender analysis of the labour market. So there's this really wonderful paper by Neil Mahoney and others, and they highlight that a large part that healthcare has boomed, and as healthcare booms, women have women's employment has also increased in that sector, and also women are achieving more senior roles. So that is a large part of the increase in female employment in the US. Meanwhile, yes, men who are the most disadvantaged in the US have typically clustered in three sectors, which is not employed at all: construction or manufacturing, and automation and global competition will hit the manufacturing.
Yes, exactly. And that showed up. I did this piece a couple of weeks ago, even in the most recent divergence in unemployment among graduates in the US between men and women. Healthcare seems to explain a lot of that. And then the other thing there is the role of education, by which I mean young women are also now so much more likely to be in higher education that if you take a snapshot of like 24, 25-year-olds, where you're including like advanced education, the striking thing I found in the UK is that young women are now more likely to be in work than young men. They're also more likely to be in education than young men. And they're more likely to be caring for some family members, whether older or younger. So it's not that young men are sort of not in work, but they're doing these other socially integrated things. They're just not doing anything. They're economically inactive. They're sort of societally inactive. And they're more likely to say they have health problems, that kind of thing. And this is coming back to your point about exclusionary and inclusionary feminism. I think one of the issues here is that just we have millennia of data showing that when you have a lot of societally unattached young men, it's not a great thing. Like bad things happen. Bad things happen for women, and bad things happen for women and for other men.
Yes.
And so this is a society thing. So yeah.
And even if society wasn't affected, we should be concerned about men who don't have a sense of purpose, matter, or feel lonely.
Bad things often happen to those men themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, this sense of like, well, I feel strongly about something, so we should just push in this direction. If you're disregarding things like this that could have really negative impacts on society for certain groups, yeah, that to me feels like, feels not great.
In numbers, how big are these numbers? Like how many men are now out of the NEETs?
Well, I'm going to pull up my article as we do this to see if I can give you an answer.
But I think the concrete and important thing to be said is anyone interested in gender inequality, it's now the young disadvantaged men are the ones who are struggling, as Richard Reeves has so famously and importantly highlighted.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll give you some numbers, but they're percentages, annoyingly. But so in the UK, the share of young men who are, let's see, employed or out of work for health reasons, or just out of work, out of education, everything for some other sort of unstated reason, it's almost 20%. So that's among 20 to 24-year-olds.
20% of young men aged between 20 to 24 are not doing anything.
Yeah, not in work, not in education, and not taking care of a family member. So that's a huge figure. And again, when you think about the fact that that is also the age group that is most likely to commit crime, you're just expanding the pool of people who might want to do bad stuff, basically, which doesn't feel great.
And how does the UK compare to other places?
So in terms of just the NEET rate, where are we? So the UK, so crossover, we've seen a crossover in the UK, in France and Canada. These are among the countries I looked at. US hasn't quite crossed over yet. And the UK is similar to France, slightly higher than Canada and the US in terms of young men being sort of socioeconomically disengaged.
And the US share. One thing that you mentioned, the US is more religious. It also doesn't have such a welfare state, right?
Yes, exactly that. And I think some of these historically male-dominated industries are still stronger there, right? So, like skilled manufacturing jobs, or any manufacturing jobs, I think are more plentiful in the US and the UK, which might help young men find jobs there that they aren't finding in, say, the UK.
Yeah, I think this is so important it's difficult to bring it all apart. But how doesn't this economic data make you think that it's difficult to pull it apart? Like the economic side of it being that 20% is such a striking figure.
Yeah.
It's surprising we don't see a bigger impact on culture. Maybe we should expect the impact on culture.
Yeah, well, but I guess part of that is this group of sort of disengaged men. The fact that you're disengaged means your cultural clout is quite limited, right? That these are not like, sure, there are in an age of TikTok, anyone can have cultural clout, but I think some of the same sort of traits that leave people in this situation leave them cut off from other means of influence as well.
Yes, totally. A guy who struggles to complete school may not be the most charismatic person who can get a massive podcast, right? So even if you don't need capital for a podcast, you still need some degree of charisma.
Exactly. Yeah. Like I always think about this as low status men are we're not just talking incels here. Like incels are a real thing. They deserve lots of study. There's a guy, William Costello, who does a lot of really good work on this.
How do you feel about using the I don't want to be too terminological, but I don't know if I want to use the term incels. I think it has such a pejorative connotation.
I think the issue there is that it's a self-labeled term, right?
Is it still a self-label?
Well, I mean, it depends how it's being used, right? But this is the point for me. Incels, I think, the problem is people think, oh, young low status men, right? Incels. When actually the incel group is much, much smaller. It's a tiny subset of that group. And a lot of these, I think about it as a bunch of these low status disengaged young men have loads of mates. They play video games, they go out in the street and hang out and play football and stuff. And these are not your sort of spotty teenagers sat on Reddit forums all day. Like both of these types of young disengaged men exist, but they're very different. And the thing I dislike about the term incels is it's used as if it applies to like 20% of young men, when it's a tiny, tiny number.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I cut you off. You were going to say about incel.
I think I was just going to say I was just going to say what I was saying there, basically. Just that disadvantaged, disengaged young men, while that feels like quite a narrow group that we zeroed in on, is still quite a diverse group in terms of ideology, social capital, all of that kind of stuff.
Yes. Okay, well, this is a very depressing ending, but I think it's an important one, John. And you just recently, can we also talk about your piece on AI? Because you were thinking about how much of any of this labour shock could be related to AI, and this is a big question that we're all stumbling around.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think both my hypothesis going into that and the fact that it wasn't borne out are interesting. So the hypothesis, I spoke to some great people at Brookings, like Molly Kinder, who's done a lot of work on this, and there's a solid hypothesis that because of tech and computer science being very male dominated, but also having adopted AI tools so quickly, the vanguard of the AI labour market disruption might be most keenly felt by recent male computer science graduates. And it turns out that, thus far at least, is not what's happening. And in fact, computer science jobs have been one of the biggest sources of employment growth for recent male graduates in the last year or so in the US. But the data I looked at underscored the point you made, or Neil Mahoney made, about health. Healthcare is a sector that is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow, right? So increasing demand from an older population, and generally very strong unions. The unions is a huge part of this, right? We think about AI disruption as just being a function of, can AI disrupt a job, or is actually will it be allowed to?
Yes.
So, and that's
we see that with trains in the UK, right?
Exactly. I mean, we have a whole transit line in London that has no drivers, but that hasn't been expanded to any of the other lines because of the unions, and we've had that for like 15 years. So yeah, it's interesting that we're not seeing this play out yet. But the other interesting point that Molly from Brookings made to me is that even if the start of the AI disruption might be more keenly felt by men, there's no reason for it to necessarily stay that way. And she made a great point, which I hadn't really thought about until I looked at, well, until she made it and I then looked at the data, which is that as a function of young women making such strides in higher education, just now vastly outnumbering young male graduates, the ranks of recently employed graduates in white collar jobs, which that group, of course, is a group that's heavily exposed to AI, are female dominated. So we still think of law, consulting, some of these sort of high status white collar jobs as being male dominated because the bosses of most of these firms are men.
Yes.
But at the junior ranks, people in their 20s who've been there for 2-3 years, they're female dominated. So if AI does sweep through graduate traineeships, as it were, that could actually be felt more keenly by young female graduates. And it would be very interesting to see how that plays out in terms of fairness and ideology and all the stuff we've been talking about.
And you could also theorize that not in terms of gender, but in terms of skill. So let's suppose, 50 years ago, only this fraction of people went to university, but now it's this fraction. Then this bottom set is going to be, they might be less skilled, that have lower human capital. So they're going to be more vulnerable to any kind of more productive replacement.
Exactly. So yeah, I think the gender lens for me is, we don't want to look through everything with this lens, but labour market disruption and AI, I think, is a really interesting one to see how it does play out, because we know that academic, the majors, the disciplines that people specialise in, and the occupations that those lead on to are heavily gender, well, not segregated, but skewed. And therefore, if AI starts hitting certain occupations more than others, it could have a really interesting gendered impact.
Yes. Okay. Now, final question, John. And this is the question I'm sure you get asked and I get asked. What do you think the solutions should be?
I think it's one where I don't necessarily think of it in terms of solutions that can be applied, but I wonder if some organic changes might help. But the main thing, it comes back to displacement, tech displacement. So I think if people start spending more time hanging out in real life at young ages, I think that will make a lot of stuff in society better. And so I wonder if the next cultural vibe shift might just be in that direction, right? Even over the last 2-3 years, there's a lot more discussion about how bad screen time is. And I don't mean sort of moral panic hand-wringing. I mean people talking about their own screen time. And so I wonder if we might start to see, it won't be universal, but as a subgroup of like Gen Z or maybe Gen Alpha when they come along, saying, "Oh, I don't do screen time," or I cut back on it. It's a sort of self-care, health, whatever type thing. And if there's a movement in that direction, I think it could be very good for the cohort that goes through that. Now, I keep looking for data on this at the moment on whether screen time might have peaked in that group, and I'm yet to find something solid.
You'd be so happy if you got screen time peaked.
Watch
That's
this space.
such a John Burn-Murdoch headline.
Watch this space, because there's preliminary evidence. I hope no one watching this steals the idea.
But wait, let me say two things. First of all, I love your idea that you might have this sort of emergent piety movement, like I don't do phones, right?
Yeah.
And if that was a prestigious identity, or I don't do this, I don't do meat, right? So humans show this capacity for regulation. So you might get a sort of the vegetarian vegan of the world, right? People eschew various pleasures because they think that's better for them, better for the world, etc. That said, so I can totally see that happening, possibly, particularly if it's around prestige, group identity, piety, feeling very righteous about yourself and signaling how righteous you are. Though I don't know how you'd signal it if you don't have a phone. I was going to say,
that's the paradox. Yeah.
How do you signal prestige and status when you don't have a phone?
Tricky.
Yeah. But then on the other hand, when tech companies are competing in an attention economy and investing constantly and innovating constantly. You just last week I was interviewing Korean computer gamers. It was amazing. And one of them, they designed all these amazing apps, tech companies, I don't think they're villains. They're just trying to make money in a competitive environment to maximize everyone's engagement and attention. And when companies are investing so much money, and when it's often the most disadvantaged kids get, left at home with a phone to play on, or, a cheaper version of an iPad to play on, then they just get immersed in this. And if you, as a kid, have spent 3 or 4 hours a day on a device, or have low self-control, less conscientious, which is, of course, the spectrum of conscientiousness, it may be harder at age 13 to suddenly self-discipline and say no devices.
Yeah, no, I totally
or even
agree.
At 34.
Yeah. And that's a key point as well. We always think of this as a teens thing, but it's
it's not.
When I'm
It's
on the
not.
tube now and I look at who's scrolling through short form videos, it's adults, it's parents, it's that type of thing.
Everyone. I go all over the world, whether I'm Mexico, Brazil, Malaysia, Indonesia, Norway. Everyone is glued. It doesn't, I think I totally support Jonathan Haidt's ambition to, tackle this for children, because that's clearly very, very important. But it's adults have got a problem.
100%. But no, I do agree. Like, it would be almost a sort of world first if if a cohort is suddenly able to just overpower the sort of massed, sort of abilities and money and marketing power of these huge industries that make deliberately addictive products. So
I do love this idea of a party movement. What you'd want is how I would do it if I was, masterminding a revolution. I would do a big Hollywood film, that makes it super cool, like a Hollywood film about a piety movement.
Yeah.
You just want to rev up the prestige and make it seem super cool, super funky, super rebellious, anti-establishment critics.
Yeah. See, I agree with you.
Yeah, I'd do a Hollywood film.
I agree with you, but I think that's also I think that's maybe how the old world would have done it. And I think now it could literally be a TikToker who spreads it, and that's the way I would. And again, who knows? This all feels far fetched, but the way I think you resolve the paradox of signaling while not being online is that people are still online. It's just they do it less. It becomes the 6-7 hours a day becomes 3 hours a day. So you're still out there signaling, but maybe you're ending each of your clips with, "Here's what I'm just about to do with my mates."
Or John, to just be totally tech.
Yes.
This is you and I doing our sci-fi rendition. Maybe if you had a new technology, what about this? So you know how lots of guys will share and post their like sports times, their run times on like a different sports app, right?
Yeah.
So let's suppose there is a very basic form of technology, and when you haven't used your phone for 8 hours a day, you click it and it does like a red beam into the internet, and you can click, and there's a website that's very simple, and all it shows is red beams. And if you don't use your device, you do a red beam, and then you just signal on a website that's only showing red beams, but then you're in the red beams.
Yeah, honestly, but this sort of thing, maybe not necessarily red beams, but that dynamic of creating quantifiable prestige for hanging out
signals,
in real life. Yeah, that's, I think, exactly how this would work. And on some level we already have that because people post pictures of them having fun, but it's some evolution of that where instead of it being a mirror selfie, it's you partying with your mates, but that becomes the thing. That's what I mean. That's why I don't really, I can't think of any top-down solution here, just that is workable and realistic. But I don't think it's totally far-fetched to think there could be a cultural shift, which, again, it would be shaped by and refracted through maybe new apps and new trends and new technology. But that's how I would see this. That's how I would see us turning the corner. Is just, more status for hanging out.
I think two things. So one, when I watch people around the world, it sounds like a weird stalker, but when I watch people around the world, I do often see people taking selfies at all kinds of different places. And once they've taken the selfie, they spend, they show themselves having fun, but then they spend a lot of time following on the device to edit it and then checking for likes and constantly being excited by the dopamine hit of peer approval and prestige. So I just don't think that there's a quote from Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And to some extent, I think that might be true here. But I think the top-down question is very interesting. And I think someone who is an instinctive liberal, I would feel extremely uncomfortable with the idea of saying that, and I don't think anyone would support it, the idea that the government should take away people's devices or the government should regulate people. I don't think anyone would ever support that. So you're right. It's really, really philosophically, politically, we're in such a liberal world that no one would want their smartphones to be taken away. But I think that would be the only way it could work. Sorry.
Totally. Yeah. So here's my trying to make it an actual prediction would be if we get to a point where, the movie Her, Joaquin Phoenix, Scarlett Johansson, if we get to the point where people have earpieces, I think that could be really interesting. And specifically earpieces, because if you have something which means you don't have to be looking at a screen, but you're still getting maybe there's a little voice which can tell you how many likes you've got, how your posts are doing and stuff, but it's not in front of your eyes. So you're out there, you're hanging out, you're able to be in person while being online. Maybe there's something there which sort of squares the circle.
But thinking about political economy, I don't see why that would ever happen, because each tech company constantly wants to innovate to keep its users hooked and online and engaged. And they'll tell investors there's been a 5% increase in people using our app. So no company wants us to use their app less.
No, but I don't think this would be anyone using any app less. As in, this earpiece will still be made by Apple or whoever, and it will still be, you'll be paying a subscription for things, and your AI assistant will become so critical to you. You'll be interacting with it all the time, and you'll pay a lot of money for that. But it won't be as intrusive as a screen that's in front of you all the time. So I don't know. We're spitballing, but maybe there's something here.
Just to counter that again, the earpiece could also become a very romantic and charming AI boyfriend girlfriend who is so beguiling and exciting that it's not just about whether the screen is in front of you, but they seem to outcompete these alternatives.
I totally hear that theory. I just think that's going to become very loser coded. But
I think that it is very difficult if people are moral policing only happens at points of social contact. And if people socialize less, there's less capacity to be shamed and ostracized by your community. So you, John, shame and stigmatize me all you like. I'm at home with, AI Jeff. And I don't give a damn.
But that's the thing. I think it would be a bottom 10% issue. So you're bottom 10% of society end up at home with their AI partner, but the top 10% are just sort of ostentatiously out there having fun while also checking in on their AI stuff. So we're going sci-fi, but that for me, something which can be highly engaging and immensely useful and give lots of money to the tech industry, but isn't between your eyes and other people. That for me could be an interesting development.
One more point just about losers. So I think for the past 50 years, progressives have always tried these well-intentioned campaigns to be super inclusive and super understanding and super embracing. And so as not to celebrate or champion a sort of heteronormative two-parent family, but to recognize families and happiness in all kinds of forms. And I think that progressives in particular have a strong reticence, reluctance, refusal to turn people with different sexualities into losers. So I think here is an important message for progressives that if they want to stem the tide of people using technology more, it would be very important and strategic to tar those people as losers. And in fact, we should recognize that shame, I'm going to sound like a right-wing conservative, but whether something is a loser is a function of how the rest of the culture and society responds to it. And if progressives do lots of think pieces in the New York Times, and there have been some in the New York Times, being pretty sympathetic of people having AI boyfriends, if the New York Times and other outlets don't turn AI boyfriends into losers, then that can raise it into 15%. And then as more of your friends have an AI boyfriend, it becomes 20%.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just think it will inherently almost be loser behavior because you won't be among other people to give you status. But I totally take your point. And I think, if that becomes tribal, if it becomes a political tribal thing, that would be a big problem.
Okay, John, I will wrap this up and just say you have been absolutely fantastic. It's been amazing discussing status and losers with you, and you've taught me so much, both about economics and culture, and I look forward to the next year of you and I chatting on WhatsApp.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
And everyone should read John's weekly columns that come out every Friday on the FT, and congratulate John, who's just come back from his paternity leave with his wonderful baby.
Thank you. I agree. Everyone should do that.